So merging two households isn't easy. Like my brother and myself. I've come back home. I'm living with my brother in the house I've been away from most of my adult life. He's had the house since my mom remarried, and he's been on his own, and I've been on my own. So you can just imagine what it's like to have two 60-something-year-old adults trying to cooperate. Not to mention, not only the merging of our lifestyles, but bringing my stuff into the house. It's literally meant rearranging the furniture of both of our lives. It's meant accommodation, flexibility, sometimes tension and misunderstanding, and in my case, letting go and releasing some things I find I can actually live without, including attitudes and judgments about what's right and what's the wrong way to take care of the trash. Except for TV. My brother is obsessed with zombies. He has to watch both series about zombies on AMC, beginning with The Walking Dead, which seems like it will never die. Now, I can make an artistic case for a metaphorical parable of the excesses of a consumer culture gone mad consuming each other. But there are limits to how many zombies I can take. I do not watch The Walking Dead with my brother. But then I stop to think, well, now we've got the dead and the undead. Two households trying to live in the same world. And so in Ephesians, we find Paul addressing two households, Gentiles and Jews, who maybe just were as extremely at odds with each other as zombies and non-zombies. Each saw the other as atheos, from which we get the word atheist, meaning without God. The Gentiles saw the Jews as being without God because they had this pantheon of gods. And who was this one God? And the Jews thought the Gentiles were without God because they had the one true God. And they had all these other idols and, two realities that were both engaged in superiority contests. Each thought they possessed the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Only to find out, says Paul, that they hold nothing but one thread in a giant tapestry of truth and reality woven by God, revealed to us in Christ. That there is a larger truth, a transcendent narrative that supersedes all of the narratives that they have written and organized their lives within. The length, breadth, height, and depth of which they and we have only begun to comprehend. For this reason, Paul says, he is down on his knees praying to the God from whom all families, hear that, all families take their name, whether they know it or not. He is praying for inner strength through his Spirit, praying that we be strengthened with power. Now, power is a valuable commodity in our world. The power to light and cool our homes, the power to run our cars. It's even exchanged in a commodity market. Most of the time we hear in the news about the abuse of power, though, don't we? Banks and Wall Street that caused our 2008 financial crisis. The Bernie Madoffs and Ponzi schemers who make off with millions of dollars of innocent people's money. Most recently in the news this week, the head of CBS being charged with sexual misconduct, and mayors and legislators and even rabbis and ministers problematic in the use of power. And in our culture, it seems from our schoolrooms to the very top of our culture is an epidemic of bullying. No human agency is immune from the desire for power. Like happened in one church that I served, where the property committee got upset and angry because Christian education and missions were included in the consideration of whether or not to allow a seniors morning out meal program to meet in the fellowship hall. You let who in on this conversation? Power sometimes is seen as a fixed sum resource. We operate out of an assumption of scarcity, Just so much to go around. More power for you means less power for me. Power is about domination and control and elimination of the competition. Or so we think. In the Old Testament, you know that familiar story of the righteous boy king, the apple of God's eye, David. He learned about the abuse of power. Power became privilege. Once he became king, he didn't have to go to the battlefield anymore. Power became entitlement. He could be with any woman he wanted. He wanted Bathsheba. So he sent Uriah, her husband, into combat to the front lines to die so that he could have her as his own and save face. Power means manipulation of resources. Power means cover-up and secrets and lies. Lies, lies. Paul knows all about the use and abuse of power. He has been a man so powerful as to be feared by those early Christians, notorious for the persecution and elimination of Christians. You remember in Acts, he was there for the stoning of Stephen. But then he becomes one of the followers of this Christ. And he faces new adversaries who oppose his outreach to the Gentiles with the gospel message and a different understanding of power. He's told us earlier in Ephesians that God has a plan for one new humanity. The dividing walls of hostility are torn down, a new household, a holy temple in which God chooses to dwell in human hearts is now the order of the day. There are no aliens, there are no strangers. The old temple in Jerusalem had barriers of separation. The new temple is open. Jesus is the face of God, loose in the world. Now the Holy of Holies can be found on a grassy hillside. Not only that, says Paul, we carry the Holy of Holies around with us everywhere we go. And we meet it in every human face because we are all one family created in the image of God, one new humanity. Paul is praying that this new household, this family of God, be strengthened and empowered to its very core with God's Spirit, the power to know the love of God. And the verbs that give expression to this are blessing, adopting, destined for good works, bestowing, loving, lavishing. These verbs serve as the rebar that holds up the structure of this living temple. And the prayer continues that we might be rooted and grounded in love. The foundation is love. The ground of our being is love. The source of all life is love. The prayer continues, asking for the power of comprehension. This power is the power of humility, to know what we cannot know fully, the sheer immensity of God's love. The image that came to mind for me is the one of Isaiah in the temple. The glory of God filled the temple, and all Isaiah could see was the hem of his robe. And I think it's interesting that when you read the Gospels, people hungry to be healed by Christ knew that if they could just touch the hem of his robe, it would be enough. The power of God is expressed in standing with and for, not over against. Paul prays that we might be filled with all the fullness of God. That is to say, that we be full of God and not full of ourselves. That might require a little interior house cleaning from time to time, a little decluttering, some rearranging of the interior furniture of our hearts and minds. There might be some ideas, some attitudes, some judgments, some prejudices that are just gathering dust and cluttering our lives and need to be cleared out to create space for God. Tilden Edwards is an Episcopal priest and one of my teachers, and he shares a parable about a monk who one day came to his master asking for help with how he might gain enlightenment. The master took the student, they were standing by a lake, took him by the head and pushed his head under the water and held him under the water until at last he let the student up, who was gasping and sputtering for breath and wet. And he said, "You must want enlightenment as much as you want that breath of air. You must want God as desperately as you want to breathe. Would you run from here to Beulahville for a chance to be face to face with Jesus? Is there room in your life for that kind of hunger? This week, David Brooks had an article in the New York Times that I posted on Facebook about what it might look like to live with that kind of power informing your life. He tells about a woman named Sarah Heminger in Baltimore. She grew up in Indiana, and she learned about the power of social isolation from her church. You see, her dad discovered that the pastor was embezzling money and taking money from the church. And when he told people about it, rather than fire the minister, they shunned the whole family for 8 years. There wasn't a social gathering, there wasn't an event in the community that they could attend as a family at which anyone ever spoke to them. Years later, she was doing graduate work at Johns Hopkins, and she observed kids in the Baltimore schools who were lonely and isolated, and she knew a thing or two about that. So she went to one of the local high school principals, and they identified some underperforming students. And then she got some of her classmates at school to volunteer to function as their extended family. They took on tasks like driving them to school or going and picking them up and taking them back to school if they skipped, taking them lunch, helping them with homework. Each kid had to sign a covenant of commitment. And each kid had 5 adults who surrounded them, and no one so far has dropped out early. Each volunteer is coached by a more experienced volunteer that they call the head of the family. And the head of the family is coached by a grandparent who supports the head. And the grandparents are coached by community managers who are some of the paid staffers for this nonprofit that's now begun to exist called The Thread. Circling this whole system are collaborators who offer special expertise when called in for legal help or SAT tutoring or mental health counseling. In short, he says the organization weaves an elaborate system of relationships, a cohesive village around the task of helping these kids thrive. The social network is as much for the adults and the city as it is for the kids. In the first few months, the kids have a hard time trusting the adults because they're not used to having adults that they can trust. But trust is built by persistence through failure. And so Heminger observes that unconditional love is so rare in life that it is identity changing when someone keeps showing up even when you reject them. It's also identity changing to be the one who is rejected. The institutional structure of the Thread is impressive, but not as impressive as the ethos that pervades it, the atmosphere. Thread cultivates an ethos of utter vulnerability which starts at the very top. If Sarah finds herself too isolated or lonely or overwhelmed, she turns to the team of people around her for help and support. The program rejects any distinction between haves and have-nots. The volunteers are not there to do social change. They are there to be changed. The word mentor is banned because everybody is leaning on everybody else. Vulnerability, mutuality, everyone leaning on each other. Power is shared. Out on that Galilean hillside that day, it was an open table. Power was shared. No gatekeepers, no limits on access to God or bread, which may be the same thing. Everyone was in the same boat. Everyone was hungry. Anne Lamott is a Presbyterian writer who says that the most powerful sermon in the world is just 2 words: me too. Me too, when you are struggling, when you are hurting, wounded, limping, doubting, questioning, barely hanging on, moments away from another relapse, and somebody can identify with you and say, me too. Someone knows the temptations that are at your door. Somebody has felt the pain that you are feeling. When someone can look you in the eyes and say, me too, and actually mean it, it can save you. when you aren't judged or lectured or looked down upon, but somebody demonstrates that they get it, that they know what it's like, that you aren't alone, that's me too. Naomi Shihab Nye is one of my favorite poets. She's a Palestinian-American Christian. She tells a story about one day being in the Albuquerque airport waiting for a flight when it was announced that her plane had been detained for 4 hours. And then she heard an announcement that if there was anyone in the vicinity of gate 4A who understood Arabic, could they please come to the gate immediately? Well, she says these days such an announcement gives one pause. But it was her gate, so she went there. There at the gate was an older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like her grandma had worn, crumpled in the floor and wailing. "Help," said the flight service person. "Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and this started happening." Well, as soon as she heard a few words in Arabic from Naomi, she began to calm down and stop crying. And Naomi found out that the woman thought her flight had been canceled, and she was going to miss an important medical appointment, and she went to pieces. Once she was calmed down, she got the name and phone number of the woman's son, and they called her son, who was to pick her up, to let him know the plane was delayed. And then they called all of her sons. And then, just for the heck of it, they called Naomi's dad, and he spoke to this woman for a while in Arabic, and they found out, of course, that they had 10 shared friends. And then Naomi thought, well, why not? Why don't I just call some of my Palestinian poet friends? And they chatted with them, and all of this took about 2 hours. This little woman was laughing by then, telling Naomi all about her life, patting her on the knee, answering questions, and then she pulled out a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar, crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts. And she began to offer them to all the women at the gate. And to Naomi's amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There was no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free beverages from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from the flight ran around serving everyone apple juice. And soon everybody was covered with powdered sugar. And then she noticed that her new best friend, and by now they were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves, which was an old country traveling tradition. Always carry a plant. Always stay rooted somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary people and thought, this is the world I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person in this gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. Naomi says she wanted to hug all these other women too. This can still happen, she said. Not everything is lost. Always stay rooted somewhere. In a world with hundreds of narratives trying to get us to fit into their little boxes of reality, there is a transcendent narrative rooted and grounded in love. The power of God at work in us is able to do exceedingly more than all we can ask or imagine, like one little boy in John's Gospel, one little boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 sardines. That's what it says in John, literally, 2 sardines. It's his picnic. We don't know the hows, but we know the willingness of this boy to offer such as he had been given, and it was enough to feed 5,000. That's the power of God working through us that exceeds all we can ask or imagine. That's the power of love at work. In the new humanity, the world gets bigger. In the new humanity, they becomes we. Them becomes us. And those becomes our. That's power. But it's not a power that we make or manage. It's just a power to which we can surrender. Amen.